The blood on the wedding dress had barely dried when Margaret O'Sullivan struck the match. The white silk torn and abandoned beside the overturned stagecoach caught fire with surprising eagerness, flames licking upward like hungry spirits, while dust clouds on the horizon marked the approach of riders whose intentions were written in the thunder of their hoofbeats. Margaret pressed herself against the rocky outcropping where she had taken shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her past burn. The wedding dress she had deliberately torched would send a message to anyone who found it. The railroad baron's daughter was dead to her old life, and what remained would not be taken easily. The memory of her mother's voice echoed in her mind, words spoken in the fever dreams before cholera claimed Mary O'Sullivan 12 years ago. "When they come for you, child, remember a cornered wolf fights harder than a free one." Margaret had cornered herself in this wilderness, but she intended to prove her mother's wisdom true. Jake Morrison groaned from where he lay, trapped beneath the overturned stagecoach, blood seeping from the gash on his forehead where he had struck the wagon's iron rim. Margaret had deliberately yanked the wheel hard to the left when she spotted the hidden pit in the trail, calculating that a controlled crash was preferable to whatever fate Seamus O'Sullivan's men had planned for runaway daughters. "Did we lose them?" Jake whispered, his voice thick with pain and confusion. Margaret listened to the approaching hoofbeats, counting at least 6 horses moving fast across the prairie. "Not yet, but we're about to." She clutched Jake's rifle with hands that trembled despite her resolve. The weapon felt foreign in her grip, but desperation was teaching her things no finishing school had ever covered. Her father's men were professional killers, and they would show no mercy to a woman who had dared to defy Seamus O'Sullivan's grand design. That's when she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, cresting the ridge to her left, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. Even at a distance, she could see this was no white pursuer. The rider sat his paint horse with a bearing that spoke of authority earned through both wisdom and warfare, his long black hair streaming behind him like a dark banner. Iron Wolf had been tracking the stagecoach since dawn, drawn by intelligence that had reached him through channels he couldn't fully trust. The message had been cryptic, speaking of an opportunity to strike a blow against the forces threatening his people's sacred lands. But as he crested the hill and saw the burning wedding dress, the overturned coach, and the young white woman crouched among the rocks, with desperate courage written in every line of her body, he began to understand that destiny had brought him something far more complex than a simple ambush. The pursuing riders, 6 hard-faced men with the look of professional killers, appeared over the rise just as Iron Wolf made his decision. Instead of melting back into the landscape as wisdom dictated, he spurred his horse forward with a war cry that seemed to tear the very air apart. Margaret watched in amazement as the Lakota warrior scattered her pursuers through nothing more than audacity and reputation. The hired guns, expecting to corner a helpless runaway bride, found themselves facing Iron Wolf himself, a man whose name was whispered in equal parts, fear and respect throughout the territories. They wheeled their horses and retreated in disorder, unwilling to test their luck against his legendary skill in combat. "You're bleeding," Iron Wolf said in careful English as he dismounted near Margaret's position, his dark eyes taking in the cuts from the crash and the rifle in her inexperienced hands. Margaret looked down at the crimson stains spreading across her torn clothing, and then back at the man who had just saved her life. Every story her father had told her about savage Indians crumbled as she met Iron Wolf's intelligent gaze and saw not the monster of territorial propaganda, but a leader whose strength was tempered with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Why did you help me?" she asked, studying his face for signs of deception. Iron Wolf looked at the burning wedding dress, the deliberately overturned stagecoach, and the young woman who had clearly chosen to face death rather than accept whatever fate had been planned for her. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same desperate courage he had seen in wounded warriors who refused to surrender, in mothers defending their children, in anyone who had been pushed beyond, and the point where survival mattered less than dignity. Because he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "I know what it means to fight for freedom when the whole world calls you a fool for trying." What neither of them knew was that their meeting, for all its apparent chance, was the culmination of plans that had been set in motion months earlier. Miles away in the railroad offices of Millbrook, Seamus O'Sullivan was already receiving reports from his network of informants. His daughter was exactly where he needed her to be, and the famous Iron Wolf was playing his part with the precision of a chess piece being moved across a board by an unseen hand. But some chess pieces have wills of their own, and some games are won by players who refuse to follow the rules. Margaret O'Sullivan had never owned anything that truly belonged to her. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that drew marriage proposals like honey draws flies, auburn hair, that caught prairie sunlight like burnished copper-green eyes that seemed to hold depths no man could fathom, and a spirit that burned bright despite 18 years of careful suppression. But in Seamus O'Sullivan's world, beauty was currency, and daughters were investments to be cashed in when the returns reached their peak. Her father had built his railroad empire through a combination of vision ruthlessness and an absolute refusal to accept the word impossible. The Irish immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and a genius for reading human weakness now controlled transportation routes from St. Louis to the California goldfields. His latest project, a transcontinental line that would make his previous achievements look like child's play, required only one thing to ensure its success: passage through the sacred burial grounds of the Lakota. The Indians lack vision. Seamus had explained to Margaret over breakfast on the morning that would become her wedding day. This Iron Wolf character can't see past his primitive superstitions to the greater good that progress brings. Sometimes visionaries must make hard choices for the benefit of those too ignorant to choose for themselves. Margaret had learned not to argue with her father's philosophical justifications, but she had also learned to recognize the particular tone he used when discussing obstacles to his ambitions. Iron Wolf would be removed one way or another. The only question was how much collateral damage Seamus considered acceptable in the process. The marriage to Thomas Grayson was supposed to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Grayson's shipping empire would complement Seamus's railroad network, creating a transportation monopoly that would dominate Western commerce for decades. More immediately, the wedding would provide perfect cover for the military operation that would finally clear the Lakota from their ancestral lands. Colonel Marcus Thornton, whose reputation for efficiency in Indian removal had earned him both promotion and notoriety, was already positioning his forces for what the territorial newspapers would describe as a tragic but necessary response to savage aggression. "Your marriage will herald a new age of prosperity," Seamus had told Margaret, speaking as if the union were some sort of humanitarian gesture rather than a business transaction. "Thomas understands the importance of territorial development. He won't interfere with necessary measures to ensure public safety." Margaret had met her intended bridegroom exactly twice, both times under her father's watchful supervision. Thomas Grayson was 43 years old, twice widowed under circumstances that were never discussed in polite society, with pale eyes that assessed her the way a horse trader might examine breeding stock. During their brief conversations, he had outlined his expectations with the clinical precision of a legal contract. She would bear him sons, manage his household with perfect efficiency, and never question his decisions or methods. In return, she would enjoy the security that came with marriage to a man of substance, and the satisfaction of knowing she had fulfilled her proper role in life. The prospect filled Margaret with a despair so complete that she had actually researched more permanent forms of escape. Only her mother's memory, preserved in dreams and fading daguerreotypes, kept her from taking that final step. Mary O'Sullivan had died in the cholera epidemic of 1835, but not before planting seeds of independence in her daughter's heart, seeds that Seamus had tried unsuccessfully to uproot through years of strict control and carefully orchestrated isolation. Sister Catherine O'Brien had been one of the few people to recognize the desperation growing behind Margaret's compliant facade. The elderly nun ran a small mission on the outskirts of Millbrook, officially ministering to the spiritual needs of Irish railroad workers and their families. Unofficially, she operated what territorial authorities preferred, not to investigate too closely, a network that helped women escape marriages that would destroy them, providing safe passage to relatives in other territories or to religious communities that asked no questions about a woman's past. The Lord provides for those who trust in His mercy. Sister Catherine had whispered to Margaret during a chance encounter at the general store, her weathered hands pressing a small piece of paper into the girl's palm. When the time comes, be ready to act on faith rather than fear. Margaret hadn't understood the cryptic message until the morning of her wedding, when the first Lakota war cries echoed across Millbrook like banshee wails. The attack had been perfectly timed, just as the wedding guests were gathering, just as Colonel Thornton's forces were positioned for their own operation, just as everyone's attention was focused on the ceremony that would seal Margaret's fate forever. What Margaret didn't know, what Sister Catherine couldn't know, was that the elderly nun's network had been compromised from its inception. Every safe house, every sympathetic driver, every escape route had been carefully mapped by Seamus O'Sullivan's agents. The railroad baron had allowed his daughter to believe in the possibility of escape because hope was an essential component of the trap he was constructing. Not just for Margaret, but for the man who would inevitably try to save her. The Indian raid that created cover for Margaret's flight was as carefully choreographed as a stage performance. The painted warriors who scattered the townspeople with their war cries never fired a shot in anger, never raised a weapon against the cowering citizens, never behaved like men bent on destruction. They were actors in a drama written by Seamus O'Sullivan, designed to provide justification for the military response that would follow, while simultaneously delivering his daughter into the hands of the one man who could be trusted to protect her, the same man whose protective instincts would ultimately destroy his ability to defend his people. Iron Wolf had participated in the mock raid, reluctantly convinced by a mysterious intermediary that creating this distraction would somehow serve his people's interests. The stranger had provided valuable intelligence about troop movements and territorial plans, information that had already proven its worth in helping the Lakota avoid several potentially disastrous confrontations. But as Iron Wolf watched the stagecoach carrying Margaret O'Sullivan disappear into the endless prairie, he felt as if he had just helped set in motion forces that would change the fundamental nature of everything he held sacred. Jake Morrison, the grizzled frontiersman who had agreed to drive Margaret to safety, was one of the few men in the territory who feared neither Seamus O'Sullivan's wealth nor the territorial government's authority. He had survived the Mexican War, lived through 3 different Indian conflicts, and buried 2 wives in unmarked graves on the frontier. His agreement to help Margaret escape had nothing to do with Sister Catherine's modest payment, and everything to do with his visceral hatred of men who treated women like livestock. "Your daddy's got long arms, miss." Jake had warned Margaret as their stagecoach raced away from Millbrook. But the prairie's bigger than any man's reach. Out there, you're just another soul trying to survive, and that's the closest thing to freedom most folks ever get. They had been racing across open country for 3 hours when Jake spotted the dust cloud behind them. Professional trackers on good horses gaining ground with the inexorable persistence of wolves following wounded prey. Jake had pushed his team to greater speed, but the stagecoach was heavily loaded and the terrain was working against them. "Hold tight, miss," he had shouted back to Margaret. "We're going to try something desperate, and I can't promise we'll both walk away from it." That's when Margaret had made her first real choice as a free woman. Instead of waiting passively for whatever Jake had planned, she had grabbed the reins from his hands and deliberately steered the left wheels into the concealed pit that crossed the trail. Her calculation had been brutally simple. A controlled crash might kill them, but capture by her father's men would certainly destroy them. The gamble had nearly cost them both their lives, But it had also accomplished something neither Jake's driving skill nor his rifle could have achieved. It had brought them to the attention of the one man in the Dakota Territory who might be able to help them or destroy them. Now, as Iron Wolf helped Margaret tend to Jake's injuries, she found herself studying the Lakota chief with a mixture of awe and calculation. This was the man her father had described as a savage obstacle to progress, but what she saw was intelligence that matched her own dignity, that put her father's pretensions to shame, and a strength that seemed to flow from sources deeper than mere physical prowess. "Your father wants my people's burial grounds," Iron Wolf said without preamble as he worked to free Jake's trapped legs, his hands gentle despite their obvious strength. "Yes," Margaret replied, seeing no point in deception. "He believes the dead have no need of the land they rest in." "And you? What do you believe?" Margaret considered the question seriously, remembering conversations with her mother about the Irish ancestors who lay buried in soil that would never be disturbed by railroad tracks or mining equipment. "I believe some things are sacred, not because of what they are, but because of what they mean to the people who love them." Iron Wolf paused in his work to study her face, reading truth in her eyes, with the skill of a man who had survived by understanding the hearts of others. This was not the spoiled daughter of privilege he had expected, but a woman whose flight from an unwanted marriage had awakened something deeper, a recognition that freedom was not something that could be given or taken, but only claimed through courage and sacrifice. "Your people would call you a fool for helping me," Margaret said as Iron Wolf finally freed Jake from the wreckage. "My people would call me many things if they knew what I was doing." Iron Wolf replied, his mouth quirking in what might have been amusement. "But foolishness and wisdom sometimes wear the same face, and only time reveals which one you've been looking at." They made camp that night in a hidden canyon where a spring provided fresh water and the high walls offered protection from both the elements and unwanted observers. Jake's injuries were serious, but not fatal, and Margaret surprised herself by proving useful in tending his wounds and preparing their simple meal over a carefully concealed fire. As they sat in the flickering light, Iron Wolf told Margaret about his people's struggle to preserve their way of life against the encroaching tide of change. He spoke of burial grounds that held the bones of 7 generations of sacred sites, where the spirits of ancestors offered guidance to the living of a culture that would disappear forever if the land that sustained it was carved up and sold to men who saw only profit in its destruction. "Your father looks at our sacred places and sees only obstacles to his railroad," Iron Wolf said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated loss. "He cannot understand that some connections transcend commercial value." Margaret found herself drawn to the quiet strength in his voice, the way he spoke of his responsibilities without self-pity or grandiose declarations. Here was a man who carried the hopes and fears of an entire people on his shoulders, yet somehow maintained his dignity and his compassion in the face of impossible odds. The contrast with her father's cold calculation and Thomas Grayson's mercenary practicality was so stark that it made her previous life seem like a dream of shadows and mirrors. "What will you do when he comes for your land?" she asked. Iron Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the dying fire like chips of obsidian. "Fight," he said finally, "and most likely die. But my children and their children will know that their fathers died as men, not as beggars selling their ancestors' bones for the promise of white man's charity." That night, as Margaret lay wrapped in buffalo robes under stars that seemed close enough to touch, she realized that she had stumbled into something far more significant than her own personal struggle for freedom. She had found herself at the center of a conflict that would determine whether dignity and honor could survive in a world increasingly dominated by greed and expedience. More than that, she had found herself caring deeply about the outcome, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of a people whose courage had shown her what it truly meant to be free. What she didn't know was that every moment of their time together was being observed and reported by watchers whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and whose silence had been assured through fear. Her father's trap was more elaborate than she had imagined, and every genuine emotion she developed, every real connection she made, was becoming another weapon in Seamus O'Sullivan's increasingly sophisticated arsenal. The first sign of trouble came 4 days later when Running Bear, one of Iron Wolf's most trusted scouts, brought word that soldiers were massing at Fort Kearney in numbers that far exceeded normal garrison requirements. More ominously, they were being led by Colonel Marcus Thornton, whose methods had earned him a reputation that left no survivors to contradict his official reports. They asked many questions about the white woman. Running Bear reported his weathered face grim with the kind of concern that came from seeing too many disasters unfold. They know she travels with us, and they speak of rescue missions and military necessity. Iron Wolf felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. If he sent Margaret away, she would face certain death in the wilderness or capture by men who would show her no mercy. If he kept her with his people, her presence would provide the excuse for a massacre that would destroy everything he had sworn to protect. Either choice led to destruction, but one would claim only his soul, while the other would claim the lives of everyone he loved. There's more. Running Bear continued reluctantly, his voice dropping to the tone warriors used when reporting truly bad news. Black Hawk has returned from the northern camps. He brings word from the tribal council, and his words are not favorable. The statement hit Iron Wolf like a physical blow. Black Hawk was his war chief, his oldest friend, and the one man whose judgment he trusted above all others. If Black Hawk had concerns about Margaret's presence among them, then the situation was even more dangerous than Iron Wolf had realized. What does he say? He says the white woman carries the scent of her father's schemes like smoke in her hair. He believes her presence among us will bring death to our children and dishonor to our ancestors. He has called for a council meeting to decide what should be done with her. Margaret, who had been sitting nearby learning to work with porcupine quills under White Dawn's patient instruction, looked up at the mention of her name. She didn't speak Lakota, but she could read tension in Iron Wolf's posture, worry in Running Bear's eyes, and something that looked like disappointment in the way White Dawn's hands had stilled on her beadwork. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, setting aside her own work to give her full attention to whatever crisis was developing. Iron Wolf was torn between his growing feelings for this woman and his absolute duty to protect his people. Every instinct told him that Margaret's flight from her father was genuine, that her developing affection for his people was real, that the connection growing between them was born of mutual respect rather than calculated manipulation. But he had not survived this long by ignoring warnings from trusted advisors, and Black Hawk's concerns could not be dismissed lightly. "My war chief believes your presence here is part of a trap," Iron Wolf said, carefully watching Margaret's face for any sign of deception or guilty knowledge. The color drained from Margaret's cheeks as the implications crashed over her like a cold wave. The possibility that her escape had been orchestrated, that her rescue by Iron Wolf had been planned, that her growing feelings for him and his people were being used as weapons, it was too horrible to contemplate, yet too logical to dismiss. "You think I'm a spy," she whispered. "That I somehow arranged to be found by you? I think," Iron Wolf said, slowly choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a field of hidden traps, "that your father is more clever than either of us realized, and that cleverness makes him more dangerous than any enemy I have ever faced." That evening, as the council fire burned low, and the elders debated Margaret's fate in voices too quiet for her to hear, she sat apart from the others, trying to make sense of the growing suspicion that her escape had been too convenient, too perfectly timed, too successful for something that should have been nearly impossible. Sister Catherine's sudden appearance at exactly the right moment, the perfectly coordinated Indian raid. that had provided cover. Jake Morrison's willingness to risk everything for a stranger, when viewed from this new perspective, it all seemed less like divine intervention and more like careful orchestration. But if her father had planned her escape, if he had somehow arranged for her to end up in Iron Wolf's camp, then what was his ultimate objective? And more importantly, what price would he exact from everyone involved when he finally revealed his hand? The answer came sooner than she expected, delivered by a messenger whose very presence confirmed her worst fears and opened up possibilities she had never imagined. The woman who rode into the Lakota camp under a white flag was not one of Seamus O'Sullivan's usual agents. She was elderly, small, and dressed in the simple brown robes of a Catholic nun. But there was something in her bearing that spoke of strength tempered by long experience with the world's cruelties and deceptions. Sister Margaret, the newcomer said, dismounting from her horse with the careful movements of someone whose bones had carried her through more adventures than most people could imagine. I believe we need to talk. Margaret stared at the nun in confusion, recognizing neither her face nor her voice. I'm sorry, sister, but I don't believe we've met. And I'm not actually a sister myself, but you will be. The older woman interrupted her voice, carrying an authority that commanded attention from everyone within hearing. My name is Sister Bernadine, and I come bearing news that will change everything you think you know about your situation. Iron Wolf stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the grip of his knife. State your business, holy woman. My people have little patience for mysteries that might bring danger to our children. Sister Bernadine studied Iron Wolf with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, taking his measure the way a general might assess an enemy commander. What she saw apparently satisfied her, because she nodded with something that looked like approval. Chief Iron Wolf, I bring greetings from Bishop Morrison, and news of a conspiracy that reaches from your sacred lands all the way to Washington itself. But first, I must speak privately with a young woman who carries secrets she doesn't even know she possesses. The words hung in the air, like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that made everyone present uncomfortable. Margaret felt her heart skip as she realized that whatever this elderly nun had come to tell her, it was going to shatter her understanding of everything that had brought her to this moment. What secrets? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sister Bernadine reached into her robes and withdrew a leather folder that bore official seals and ribbons. The secret of why Sister Catherine was really helping runaway brides. The secret of who has been funding her network. And the secret of what your father has been planning all along, not just for you, but for the entire future of this territory. Margaret's world tilted as she began to understand that the betrayal went deeper than even her worst suspicions had imagined. Sister Catherine is not the simple mission worker she appears to be, Sister Bernadine confirmed. She is an agent of the federal government working undercover to gather intelligence on territorial corruption. Her network of safe houses was designed not to save women, but to create a web of informants who could monitor the activities of men like your father. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sister Catherine, who had seemed like an angel of mercy, who had risked everything to help her escape that woman, was a spy using desperate women as unwitting tools in a larger game of political intrigue. Then my escape was genuine on your part, but anticipated by forces you couldn't see. Your father knew about Sister Catherine's real identity, knew about her network, and allowed it to operate because it served his purposes. He used her to arrange your escape because he needed you to end up exactly where you are now. Iron Wolf's jaw tightened as he began to understand the full scope of the manipulation that had brought Margaret into his camp. She was bait in a trap we couldn't see. Yes and no. Sister Bernadine replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone revealing a truth more complex than simple deception. She was bait, but not the kind your father intended. You see, Sister Catherine's true loyalty was never to the federal government that employed her. It was to the Catholic Church that had sent her on a deeper mission, one that your father never suspected and that the government never authorized. Margaret felt her mind reeling as she tried to process revelations that kept shifting like sand beneath her feet. What mission? To prevent a war that would destroy both your peoples and claim thousands of innocent lives. Sister Catherine discovered that your father's plans went far beyond building a railroad. He intended to provoke a massive Indian uprising that would justify the complete extermination of every tribe between here and California. Your escape was meant to trigger that war by giving him the perfect excuse to claim that his daughter had been kidnapped and murdered by savages. The words seemed to echo across the hidden canyon like thunder, carrying with them the stench of a conspiracy so vast and vile that it made Margaret's personal suffering seem trivial by comparison. Her father hadn't just been planning to sell her into an unwanted marriage, he had been planning to use her death as justification for genocide. "But I'm not dead," Margaret said weakly. No. And that's what has forced him to reveal his true plans earlier than he intended. Sister Catherine's counter-conspiracy, using your genuine escape to place you under Iron Wolf's protection rather than delivering you to martyrdom, has disrupted his timeline and exposed his hand to those of us who have been watching for such opportunities. Sister Bernadine opened the leather folder and withdrew a document that bore the seal of the territorial governor. Mr. Seamus O'Sullivan is hereby charged with conspiracy to commit genocide fraud against the federal government and treason against the United States. Colonel Thornton, who has been cooperating with these plans, faces court-martial and imprisonment. The railroad contracts that were obtained through these illegal means are hereby declared null and void. Margaret stared at the warrant, as if it were written in a foreign language, unable to process the idea that her father's seemingly invincible empire could be brought down by pieces of paper and legal procedures. "How?" she whispered. "Sister Catherine wasn't the only undercover agent working in this territory," Sister Bernadine explained. "The church has been investigating rumors of territorial corruption for months, working with federal authorities who were beginning to suspect that certain railroad contracts had been obtained through illegal means. Your father's plan to use your death as a justification for war was the final piece of evidence they needed to move against him." Iron Wolf had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. But now he stepped forward with a question that cut to the heart of his concerns. "If this is true, if O'Sullivan's power is broken, what does that mean for my people?" Sister Bernadine smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, the expression reached her eyes. "It means, Chief Iron Wolf, that your sacred lands are now under the protection of federal law, and that the church is prepared to recognize them as a permanent mission territory, if you're willing to accept such an arrangement." The offer hung in the air, like the promise of rain after a long drought, carrying with it the possibility of survival dignity. And something that Iron Wolf had never dared to hope for a future where his people could adapt to the changing world without losing everything that made them who they were. But Margaret had one more question, one that touched the deepest fears that had been growing in her heart since Sister Bernadine's arrival. "What happens to me if my father is arrested, if his plans are exposed? Where does that leave me?" Sister Bernadine's smile grew broader, and Margaret could see something that looked remarkably like affection in the elderly nun's weathered features. "That, my dear child, depends entirely on what you choose for yourself. You can return to the world you fled, claim your inheritance from your father's dissolved estate, and make a new life among your own people. Or you can do what Sister Catherine originally intended, take religious vows, and dedicate your life to building bridges between peoples who desperately need to understand each other. The church would welcome such a commitment, especially from someone who has already proven her courage and her dedication to justice." Margaret looked around the canyon that had become more of a home to her than any place she had ever lived, taking in the faces of people who had accepted her, despite every reason to view her with suspicion. She thought about Iron Wolf's quiet strength, White Dawn's patient teaching, Running Bear's protective watchfulness, and all the children who had begun to look at her with the trust they reserved for family members. "And if I chose religious life, What would happen to my relationship with Iron Wolf and his people? You would serve as a permanent liaison between the church and the Lakota, helping to ensure that the protections we're offering remain in place and that the cultural exchange we're proposing benefits both peoples equally. It would be a life of service, but also a life that allows you to remain part of the community you've come to love. Iron Wolf had been listening to this conversation with emotions that warred between hope and resignation. The possibility that Margaret might choose to stay, that their connection might be preserved, even if it could never be expressed in conventional terms, was more than he had dared to hope for. But he also understood that asking her to sacrifice her chance at a normal life for the sake of his people was a burden that no one should have to bear. "Margaret," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since they had met, "you should not make this choice for my sake or for my people's sake. You should make it only if it serves your own heart's truth." Margaret studied his face, seeing in his eyes the same love that had been growing in her own heart, but also the wisdom that recognized that some gifts were too precious to be selfishly claimed. He was offering her freedom to choose her own path, even if that path led away from him forever. But before she could respond, and the sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet of the canyon, and Margaret realized that whatever choice she made would have to wait. Seamus O'Sullivan had arrived to collect his daughter, and he had brought enough armed men to turn the hidden canyon into a battlefield. The confrontation that followed would test every alliance that had been forged, every trust that had been built, and every hope that had been kindled in the weeks since Margaret's flight from civilization. It would also reveal that some traps are so complex that the only way to escape them is to spring them deliberately, accepting whatever consequences that choice might bring. Iron Wolf's warriors moved with the fluid efficiency of men who had trained for this moment their entire lives, taking positions among the rocks that would give them maximum advantage if fighting became necessary. But Margaret could see in their faces that they understood the odds, even with the advantage of terrain, and they were outnumbered and outgunned by professional soldiers who would show no mercy to anyone who stood between them and their objective. Seamus O'Sullivan rode into the canyon at the head of a full company of cavalry, his face showing none of the concern one might expect from a father seeking his lost daughter. Instead, his expression held the cold calculation that Margaret remembered from her childhood, the look he wore when negotiating business deals that would determine the futures of entire communities. Colonel Thornton rode beside him, but something in the military man's bearing suggested that he was no longer the confident enforcer of territorial policy that he had been just days before. His uniform looked less crisp, his posture less assured, and his eyes held the worried expression of a man who had begun to suspect that he was on the wrong side of history. "Off, daughter." Seamus called out his Irish accent, making the words sound like both endearment and command. "It's time to come home. This adventure of yours has gone on quite long enough." Margaret stepped forward, moving past Iron Wolf, despite his protective gesture, and faced her father across the width of the canyon. The woman who met Seamus O'Sullivan's gaze was not the frightened girl who had fled from her wedding, but someone who had been tempered by hardship and transformed by discovering what she was truly capable of when fighting for something larger than herself. "I am home," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Seamus's expression hardened as he realized that his daughter's defiance was not the temporary rebellion he had anticipated, but a fundamental change that would not be easily overcome. "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret. These savages have obviously filled your head with romantic nonsense, but you're still my daughter and you'll do as you're told." "Actually, Mr. O'Sullivan," Sister Bernadine said, stepping forward to stand beside Margaret. "She will do as the law requires, and the law currently requires your immediate surrender to federal authorities." She held up the warrant that bore the territorial governor's seal, and Margaret watched her father's face change as he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. But Seamus O'Sullivan had not built a railroad empire by surrendering at the first sign of opposition. "Legal documents can be challenged, sister," he said with the confidence of a man who had bought and sold judges like livestock. "And even if they can't, accidents happen in the wilderness. Tragic accidents that leave no witnesses to contradict official reports." The threat hung in the air, like the scent of gunpowder, and Margaret realized that her father was prepared to order the deaths of everyone in the canyon, rather than accept defeat. Colonel Thornton's hand moved toward his sidearm, but his gesture was hesitant, reluctant, the movement of a man who had begun to understand that some orders should not be followed. That's when Black Hawk chose to make his entrance. Iron Wolf's war chief appeared at the mouth of the canyon, like a figure from a vision, mounted on a white horse and flanked by what appeared to be every warrior from the northern camps. But there was something wrong with the picture. Something that made Margaret's blood run cold as she began to understand, that this was not the rescue it appeared to be. Iron Wolf. Black Hawk called out, his voice carrying easily across the canyon. "Step aside. This matter is between the white men and their own kind. It does not concern the Lakota." Iron Wolf stared at his oldest friend with growing disbelief as the implications of Black Hawk's words sank in. "You would leave her to face this alone. I would save our people from destruction for the sake of one white woman's foolish choices." Black Hawk replied, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man who had made peace with decisions that sickened him. "O'Sullivan has made it clear that interfering with his business will bring the full weight of the federal government down on every Lakota band from here to the Missouri River. Is one woman worth the deaths of all our children?" Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she realized that Iron Wolf's most trusted advisor was abandoning her to whatever fate her father had planned. But as she studied Black Hawk's face more carefully, she began to see something that didn't match his words. A tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of a man acting against his deepest convictions. "Black Hawk," Iron Wolf said, his voice carrying the weight of years of friendship and shared battles. "What has happened to you?" The war chief's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something that looked like pain, before the mask of cold pragmatism reasserted itself. "I have learned to see clearly, brother. The white man's world is coming whether we welcome it or not. We can resist and be destroyed, or we can adapt and survive. By betraying everything we hold sacred, by choosing life over pride, survival over glory." Black Hawk's voice carried the bitter conviction of a man who had wrestled with impossible choices and found no answers that didn't require sacrifice. "O'Sullivan has offered terms. Protection for our people land, where we can live in peace, resources to help us build a future in the white man's world. All he asks in return is his daughter and our promise not to interfere with his business." Seamus O'Sullivan smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had just seen his most important chess piece moved into position. "You see, daughter, even the Indians understand the value of practical compromise. Chief Black Hawk recognizes that progress serves everyone's interests, including his own people's." But Sister Bernadine stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention from everyone present. "Chief Black Hawk, are you aware that the man you're negotiating with has just been charged with federal crimes that include conspiracy to commit genocide against your people?" Black Hawk's face showed no surprise, only a weariness that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "I am aware of many things, holy woman. I am aware that federal charges can be dropped if the right pressure is applied. I am aware that men like O'Sullivan have survived worse accusations and emerged stronger than before. And I am aware that my people will not survive another war, regardless of what justice the white man's law promises." Margaret realized with growing horror that Black Hawk was not betraying Iron Wolf out of greed or cowardice, but out of a desperate love for his people that had twisted itself into something that looked like its opposite. He had convinced himself that collaboration with evil was better than resistance that would lead to extinction. "There's another way," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Every eye turned toward her, and Margaret felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But instead of being crushed by it, she found herself standing straighter, thinking more clearly than she had since this nightmare began. What if I choose neither? She continued, her mind racing as possibilities crystallized into a plan that was audacious enough to work. What if I don't go with my father? But I also don't stay here as a source of conflict between Iron Wolf and Black Hawk. Seamus frowned, sensing that his daughter was about to disrupt his carefully laid plans once again. What are you talking about? I'm talking about removing myself from the equation entirely, Margaret replied, turning to face Sister Bernadine. Sister, you said the church would welcome my commitment to religious life. I formally request to take vows, immediately placing myself under ecclesiastical protection that transcends territorial authority. The audacity of her declaration stunned everyone present. Margaret was proposing to become a nun, on the spot transforming herself from a valuable asset in her father's schemes into someone who could not be touched without bringing the full weight of the Catholic Church down on anyone who harmed her. Margaret, Iron Wolf said quietly, understanding immediately what she was sacrificing. You don't have to. Yes, I do. She interrupted, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised even herself. This is the only way to save your people from being forced to choose between honor and survival. If I'm no longer available as a bargaining chip, then Black Hawk's compromise becomes unnecessary, and my father's threats become meaningless. Sister Bernadine studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone weighing souls in the balance. Child-taking religious vows is not a strategy to be adopted lightly. It's a commitment that will define the rest of your life. I understand, Margaret replied. But I also understand that some commitments are worth making, especially if they require sacrificing what we want most for the sake of what matters most. The elderly nun nodded slowly, reaching into her robes to withdraw a simple wooden cross. Then kneel, Margaret O'Sullivan, and prepare to become something your father's money cannot buy, and his influence cannot touch. But Seamus O'Sullivan had not built his empire by accepting defeat gracefully. Colonel Thornton, he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. Arrest that woman before she can complete this charade. She's obviously been brainwashed by these savages into making decisions she's not competent to make. Colonel Thornton's hand moved toward his weapon, but his gesture was slow, reluctant. The federal warrant that Sister Bernadine carried had changed the political calculations that governed his actions, and attacking a woman in the process of taking religious vows would create exactly the kind of scandal that could end careers and topple governments. Mr. O'Sullivan, the colonel said carefully, I'm not sure we have the authority to interfere with religious ceremonies. That you have the authority I give you. Seamus exploded, his careful composure finally cracking completely. I own half the territorial government and finance the other half. My word is law in this territory, and I say that woman is coming with me whether she likes it or not. That's when Black Hawk made his move, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of supporting Seamus O'Sullivan's demand, the war chief spurred his horse forward and positioned himself between the railroad baron and Margaret. His warriors followed suit, creating a human barrier that would have to be destroyed before anyone could reach the woman kneeling before Sister Bernadine. Us, Black Hawk. Seamus said, his voice dangerous with suppressed fury. What do you think you're doing? What I should have done from the beginning. Black Hawk replied, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent during his earlier surrender. I thought I could save my people by betraying my friends. But I see now that a people who survive through dishonor have not truly survived at all. Margaret looked up from where she knelt to see Iron Wolf and Black Hawk standing side by side for the first time since this crisis had begun, their friendship restored by the shared recognition that some things were worth dying for. The sight filled her with a joy so intense that it almost compensated for everything she was about to sacrifice. "Then you've all chosen death," Seamus said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Colonel, your orders are clear. These Indians have kidnapped my daughter and are preventing her rescue. Use whatever force is necessary to complete your mission." Colonel Thornton looked around the canyon, taking in the Lakota warriors positioned among the rocks, the federal warrant that Sister Bernadine still held, and the woman kneeling before a makeshift altar with a kind of serene determination that suggested she had found something worth dying for. His military training told him to follow orders, but his political instincts warned him that this was exactly the kind of situation that destroyed careers and created congressional investigations. "Mr. O'Sullivan," he said finally, "I think we need to reconsider our approach to this situation." "There's nothing to reconsider," Seamus roared. "I am giving you a direct order, which I cannot legally follow." Thornton interrupted his voice, taking on the formal tone of a man making an official statement. "The federal warrant charging you with multiple crimes makes it impossible for me to act on your authority. Furthermore, interfering with religious ceremonies is explicitly prohibited under territorial law, and attacking federal agents is a court-martial offense." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that the trap her father had spent months constructing was finally collapsing around him. But the tears were not just of relief, they were of grief for everything she was giving up, all the possibilities that were being closed off by the choice she was making. Sister Bernadine placed her weathered hand on Margaret's head and began to speak the words that would transform her from Margaret O'Sullivan into Sister Margaret Mary, a bride of Christ, whose first commitment would be to building bridges between peoples who had learned to see each other as enemies. "Do you, Margaret, renounce all worldly attachments and dedicate your life to the service of God and His people?" "I do." Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Do you promise to serve as a peacemaker between peoples, a teacher of understanding, and a witness to the power of love over hatred?" "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me by the Catholic Church and the territorial government, I accept your vows and welcome you into religious life. Rise, Sister Margaret Mary, and may your service bring glory to God and peace to His children." Margaret rose to her feet, feeling somehow different, not diminished by what she had given up, but enlarged by what she had chosen to embrace. She was no longer the railroad baron's daughter, no longer a pawn in political games, no longer a woman whose value was measured by her usefulness to men's ambitions. She was something new, something that belonged entirely to herself and to the calling she had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. Seamus O'Sullivan stared at his daughter with an expression that mixed rage, disbelief, and something that might have been grudging admiration. "You think this changes anything? You think hiding behind religious vows will protect you from the consequences of your choices? I think—" Margaret replied, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised everyone who heard it. "That some things are more important than consequences. I think love is stronger than fear, and truth is more powerful than all the money you've spent trying to buy your version of the future." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of yet another party of riders, this time a group that carried the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. The territorial marshal rode at their head, flanked by deputies, and accompanied by a man in expensive civilian clothes who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Seamus O'Sullivan." The marshal called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with official finality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy fraud and violations of federal statutes governing territorial development. You will surrender yourself immediately or face the consequences of resisting federal authority." The words hit Seamus like physical blows, but he was not finished fighting. "Marshal Davies, I think you'll find that your jurisdiction in this matter is not as clear-cut as you believe. I have friends in Washington who will be very interested to hear how territorial law enforcement is being used to interfere with legitimate business enterprises. Had friends, the civilian corrected, stepping forward to address Seamus directly. My name is Federal Judge Harrison, and I've been authorized by the Department of Justice to inform you that your friends in Washington are currently facing their own federal investigations. The corruption that has infected this territory reaches much deeper than your railroad schemes, and cleaning it up will require removing everyone who has participated in it. Margaret watched her father's face as he realized that his entire network of influence and protection was crumbling simultaneously. The invincible empire he had built through bribery, intimidation, and manipulation was revealed to be nothing more than a house of cards that was collapsing at the first breath of genuine federal oversight. But Colonel Thornton, Judge Harrison continued, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation of your role in these matters. Your cooperation with the ongoing investigation will be taken into account when determining the severity of the charges brought against you. The colonel's shoulders sagged as he understood that his military career was over regardless of what happened next. His choice to follow Seamus O'Sullivan's illegal orders had destroyed any chance he might have had of salvaging his reputation or his future. But Margaret found herself feeling something unexpected as she watched these powerful men face the consequences of their actions, not satisfaction or vindictive pleasure, but a deep sadness for the waste of it all. Her father could have used his talents and resources to build something genuinely beneficial for the territory. Colonel Thornton could have served his country with honor instead of allowing himself to be corrupted by greed and ambition. Instead, they had chosen a path that led inevitably to disgrace and ruin. Father, she said quietly, stepping toward Seamus as the federal deputies moved to place him in custody. It didn't have to be this way. Seamus looked at his daughter now, Sister Margaret Mary, with an expression that held more complexity than she had ever seen in his face before. Perhaps not, he said finally. But I am what I am, Margaret, and I cannot change that any more than you can change what you've chosen to become. I could pray for you, she offered, if you wanted me to. For just a moment, Seamus O'Sullivan's mask of cold calculation slipped, revealing something that looked almost like regret. Pray for yourself, daughter. You'll need all the help you can get to live with the choices you've made. As the federal authorities led her father away, Margaret felt a chapter of her life closing forever. The man who had shaped her childhood, who had tried to control her destiny, who had inadvertently led her to discover her true calling. That man was disappearing into a future that would hold nothing but consequences for the decisions he had made. Iron Wolf approached her as the sound of departing horses faded into the distance, his expression holding a mixture of admiration and sorrow. You saved my people by sacrificing everything you wanted for yourself. No, Margaret replied, surprising him with the certainty in her voice. I found everything I wanted by giving up everything I thought I needed. She looked around the canyon that had become the birthplace of her new life, taking in the faces of people who had accepted her despite every reason to view her with suspicion. I wanted to be free, and now I am. I wanted to matter to make a difference, and now I can. I wanted to be part of something larger than myself, and I've found that too. Black Hawk approached them, his face showing the kind of peace that comes from making the right choice, even when it's the hard choice. Sister Margaret Mary, he said formally, my people owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You showed us that honor and survival are not opposing forces, but parts of the same truth. You don't owe me anything, Margaret replied. We saved each other, and that's what people who care about each other do. Sister Bernadine, who had been watching these exchanges with the satisfied expression of someone whose plans had worked out better than expected, stepped forward to address the assembled group. There's work to be done, she announced. Sister Margaret Mary's vows commit her to serving as a bridge between your peoples, and that bridge needs to be built one relationship, one understanding, one act of cooperation at a time. Over the following months, Margaret threw herself into her new calling with the same intensity she had once reserved for resisting her father's control. She established the first mission school in Lakota territory, teaching children from both cultures in a building that stood on land that had been consecrated as a symbol of the peace that was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Iron Wolf negotiated new treaties with the territorial government agreements that recognized Lakota sovereignty while establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence with the growing number of settlers. The discovery of gold on sacred lands remained a secret known only to a few trusted individuals who understood that some treasures were too precious to be measured in monetary terms. The seasons turned, and the Dakota Territory began to develop a reputation as a place where different peoples could live together without losing their individual identities. Visitors from other territories came to study the unique relationship that had developed between the Lakota and white settlers, hoping to replicate the success elsewhere. Years passed, and Margaret aged into a woman whose wisdom was sought by tribal councils and territorial governors alike. She never married, never bore children of her own, but she became a mother to hundreds of students who learned from her that education was not about replacing one culture with another, but about building bridges that allowed different ways of understanding the world to enrich each other. Iron Wolf never took another wife, though Lakota custom would have permitted it. When asked about his choice, he would simply say that his heart had been given to a woman who belonged to God, and that sharing in her dedication to service was more fulfilling than any earthly marriage could have been. On a spring morning in 1897, 50 years after the events that had brought them together, Sister Margaret Mary received a package with no return address. Inside, wrapped in doeskin decorated with traditional beadwork, was an eagle feather and a letter written in the careful English that Iron Wolf had learned as a child, to the woman who chose to save souls instead of claiming them. The letter read, "I write this knowing that my time grows short, but my heart remains full of gratitude for the gift of knowing you and the privilege of watching you transform the world through the power of selfless love. Our sacred lands remain protected. Our children learn in the schools you built. Our people prosper in ways that would have been impossible without your sacrifice. But more than that, your example has shown us that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the courage to choose service over self. You chose to preserve our connection by transforming it into something eternal, not the temporary joining of two hearts, but the permanent joining of two peoples in service to the Creator who made us all. In doing so, you created a legacy that will endure long after our bodies have returned to the earth. I face the journey to the spirit world with joy, knowing that the love we shared became something larger and more lasting than either of us could have imagined. You proved that some loves are too precious to be possessed and can only be honored by giving them away. Until we meet again in the place where all peoples are one, I remain your devoted partner in the work of peace." Sister Margaret Mary read the letter 3 times, her aged hands trembling as she realized that Iron Wolf was saying goodbye. She placed the eagle feather in her prayer book and knelt before the small altar in her private chapel, offering thanks for a love that had transformed itself into something more powerful than possession, more lasting than physical union, more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined possible. Iron Wolf died peacefully that autumn, surrounded by children and grandchildren, who carried both Lakota blood and the values he had learned from a young Irish woman who chose to become a nun. His funeral was attended by representatives from 7 different tribes, the territorial government, and the Catholic Church, all of whom recognized him as a leader who had shown them a better way to live. Sister Margaret Mary followed him 2 years later, passing away quietly in the mission school she had built with her own hands and her own dreams. Her funeral drew mourners from across the continent, former students who had become teachers and leaders, Lakota elders who remembered the young woman who had saved their people. Irish immigrants who saw in her story a model for their own struggles with displacement and discrimination. They were buried on the same hill overlooking the mission school, their graves marked with simple stones that bore no mention of personal sacrifice or individual achievement. But the real monument to their love was the community that continued to thrive around them, a place where the dreams of a railroad baron's daughter and a Lakota chief had been transformed into something larger and more lasting than either had imagined possible. The prairie wind still blows across the Dakota Territory, but it no longer carries the sound of war cries or the scent of gunpowder. Instead, it carries the laughter of children, playing games that blend two cultures, the songs of families that honor multiple traditions, and the whispered stories of a love that proved stronger than hatred, wiser than greed, and more enduring than the forces that had seemed destined to destroy it. Margaret and Iron Wolf's legacy lives on not just in the institutions they created, but in the fundamental change they brought to the way different peoples see each other. They proved that love could be a force for justice, rather than just personal happiness, that sacrifice could create rather than destroy. And that sometimes the greatest adventures are not about conquering new territories, but about discovering new ways to be human. Their story became legend told in schoolrooms and around campfires passed down through generations as proof that even in the harshest circumstances, even in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles, love could find a way to transform the world. Not the selfish love that demands possession, but the sacred love that gives itself freely for the good of others, and the kind of love that Margaret and Iron Wolf discovered in each other, and then shared with everyone whose life they touched. The nun who fled a forced marriage had indeed honored her sacred vow to the Lakota chief, not through earthly union, but through spiritual partnership in service to something greater than themselves. In choosing God together, they had found a way to serve their peoples, their consciences, and the future in ways that neither could have accomplished alone. Their love story ended not with separation or sacrifice, but with transformation and the kind of complete transcendent conclusion that redeems everything that came before and creates hope for everything that comes after. They had faced the worst that human nature could offer, and they had answered with the best that human nature could become. The eagle feather still rests in Sister Margaret Mary's prayer book, preserved in the Mission Museum as a symbol of love that chose to serve rather than possess. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the sunset paints the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, visitors say they can still feel their presence, not as ghosts clinging to the past, but as spirits who found a way to make their love eternal by giving it away to anyone who needed to believe that a better world was possible.